first time. And as we remember, I think it was someone told us years back that you have to hear things at least 7 times in order for it to sink in. So this is a reiterating of the law and the customs that were important to this new group of people that were forming. And we're always forming and reforming. And this is from the 8th chapter, 7 through 18. Hear the words of the Lord. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with flowing streams, with springs, underground waters welling up in the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees, pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat bread without scarcity, where you will not lack for nothing, a land whose stones are iron and from whose hills you may mine copper. You shall eat your fill and bless the Lord your God for the good land that he has given you. Take care that you do not forget the Lord your God by failing to keep his commandments, his ordinances, and his statutes, which I commanded you today. When you have eaten your fill and have built fine houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then do not exalt yourself, forgetting the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness, an arid wasteland and with poisonous snakes and scorpions. He made water flow for you from flint rock, and fed you in the wilderness with the manna that your ancestor did not know, to humble and to test you, and in the end to do you good. Do you not say to yourselves, my power and my might on my own is at my own hand, have gotten me this wealth? But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, so that you may confirm his covenant that he swore to your ancestors, and doing so today. These are the words of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Deuteronomy, very fascinating book, one of those that is part of the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament, also called the Torah. Interestingly, thought that some people still believe that this was written by Moses, and it was a time when, as I mentioned before, the Hebrews needed to know what it was to live in a land that was filled with, as we often said, with milk and honey. A prosperous land, but not to be, someone says, it was a warning, seductive power of prosperity that encourages complacency and ease that past failures may be forgotten. How many of you are genealogy people? Go back and, there's a few of you out there that really go through this. How far back do you go with your family? How far? Way far. Okay. I know my husband's niece, going through the McCurdy family goes back to, I guess, the 16th century, finding out who the McCurdys were. Now, we haven't done so well with my side of the family. But it's important to know where you come from, isn't it? So many times if you're studying family systems, you start to see a pattern of what's happening in your family. Sometimes you see, if you go back, you'll see that somebody was a great artist, or someone was a great musician, or someone was skilled with their hands, a great carpenter or a machinist, or someone who knew how to do things very creatively. We go back and look at those. And sometimes we find things in that family tree that we don't want other people to know about. Sometimes we want to hide those people away, but yet they're there. They're part of who we are and who we are today. Some of those people we would rather forget, but yet they're there. And they're part of who we are and where we are today. Sometimes it seems like in the midst of all of this, we forget where we have come from. And that's why it seems to be important to do that. Other people don't feel that way. And yet on this Thanksgiving time, we spend time in thinking of ways that we can be thankful. We read a number of them from you in the congregation today. Most of us can add a lot more to those things and what we can be thankful for. Now, Thanksgiving Day goes back in quite a few years. When I was looking some research. It goes back into to a gunpowder plot in England. Do some of you remember Guy Fawkes? Hear about Guy Fawkes? He was one of those who thought that they wanted to get rid of Protestantism, the day that you got rid of Protestantism. And he was apparently a Roman Catholic and decided to blow up Parliament. The plot was found out, and actually, not surprisingly, these plotters were executed, and then a day of Thanksgiving was given. Now, it seems like we always have to find ways of destroying our enemy, don't we? It seems to be a harsh reality, even in our world today. If you don't agree with me, I want to find a way to diminish who you are. I want to get back at you for some way if you've hurt me. Does that sound familiar? We have it happening throughout the world. If we want to get rid of you, we decimate you. We try to wipe you off the face of the earth. It seems like something that is part in our DNA, and we can't seem to get away from it. And yet they did have a time of Thanksgiving. In 1605, we're told that they had a day of Thanksgiving, thanking God for salvaging them throughout this difficult time. But we know that sometimes, yet throughout even our own country, there were times in our own country's history, if we want to go back to Jamestown, Virginia, where people came to try to establish a settlement, and how difficult it was. Out of 400 and some people, at the end of a year or so, there were only about 30 left. And the only reason they survived is finally a ship came from England with supplies and needed life for life. Or we want to go back perhaps to Plymouth. Have any of you ever visited Plymouth Plantation? I lived near there for a while, and we visited it several times when we were first married, and then after our children, we took them back to that area. Fascinating place. A reproduction of what the colonists lived through. But we know, too, they had a very difficult time. Didn't know how to adjust to a new land, how to find enough food and shelter. Very difficult. A third of those were all that was around after those first few years after 1671. It seems like in our country, every time there is a time of great disaster, there's a prayer or a time of thanksgiving. And how this evolved with, was it Sarah Hale, I think it was, who was one of those who said, let's have a day of Thanksgiving, Mr. President. And this probably, I think it was back with the time of Abraham Lincoln. Maybe it even started with George Washington. Let's go back to George Washington for a minute. Some of you historical buffs, do you remember seeing some of those pictures of George Washington kneeling in the snow, offering a prayer to God for deliverance of times when the struggle for the American Revolution was at its worst, when life seemed at no way that anything could ever come out of them. If you read some of the stories of history during that time period, they weren't fed well or clothed well. And a lot of the women, even mothers and family members, would take some of their own clothing and stitch it for the soldiers, or take the food to them or provide for them during their time of service. Difficult times. George Washington's in his prayer, as he says that he wants all the nation to join together. A day of public prayer, thanksgiving, grateful to Almighty God, and hopefully that the war would be concluded. We get to probably ask also a blessing to the people. He said the government was a blessing to the people. I don't know whether people still feel that way today. He acknowledged, he said, our practice and of true religion and virtue, always asking for God's blessing. Amazing, isn't it? Sometimes it's when we were at our lowest and the worst place in our lives, we finally realize what we are to do. We are to ask God for help. We are asked God for blessing. And sometimes, even those difficult, hard times become known as a blessing, because it gets us in tune with who we are to be in tune with, who we are to put our strength and our courage and our faith in. Abraham Lincoln, another time during another very difficult war in our country, had a Thanksgiving proclamation. In it, he said he has to set aside the last Thursday of the month of November as a day of thanksgiving and praise. In the midst of civil strife, he said, we are humbled because of the penitence for all, for the perverseness and disobedience we have in our country. He said, we commend to God for tender care. And he emphasized the widows, the orphans, the mourners, and the sufferers, in the war that we are engaged, Almighty God, to heal the wounds of the nation and to restore. Powerful words. And ever since, every president has had a Thanksgiving proclamation. Even Barack Obama had one every year that he's been president. And this was his one for last year. So this one, on the 27th of November, there'll be another Thanksgiving proclamation. All presidents have done it since then. This is what he says in conclusion. I, therefore, Barack Obama, President of the United States of America, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution and the laws of the United States, do hereby proclaim Thursday, and I'll say November 27th, as a National Day of Thanksgiving. I encourage people of the United States to join together, whether in our homes, places of worship, community centers, or any places of fellowship for friends and neighbors, and give thanks for all we have received in the past year. Express appreciation for those lives who have enriched our own and share our bounty with others. Some of the things that I've been reading through, and just think of ways of people offering thanks. Young girl talking about what it's like to live in a war-torn area where she's watched her family and friends be killed, where she has not been able to go to school because they've had to close the school and they only meet periodically, of not knowing what it is to have food on the table, being thankful for an orange. How many of you are thankful for a piece of fruit? She says, and thankful that we can go out of doors and breathe the fresh air. Or that we have the opportunity, she said, we might not have food, but we have some old magazines where we look at the pictures of the food and try to remember what it tasted. Or another story that Irma Baumbrett, many of you remember her, tells of a little girl, 8 years old, who was going through chemotherapy. And she asked what was coming up for her birthday, and asked her what she wanted for her birthday. And the little girl thought, an 8-year-old, and said, I don't know. I have 2 sticker books and my favorite doll. I have everything I need. Amazing, isn't it, what sometimes children can remind us. Or remember some of the wonderful things that some of the people have done for us in our lives. Those blessings that people have given us. When you do something for others, do you want them to do it back to you? I do. I say, if I do something nice for you, I want you to find somebody else to do something nice for them. Let's pass along the idea of doing that. It's fascinating, isn't it? Another story of a young wife who came to Dr. James Moore. She had just lost her husband. He was just 26 years old in a farming accident. She was left with 3 preschool children. And she looked around and she said, I don't know. I don't know how I'm going to get along, but I know one thing for sure. I can either get bitter or I can get better. I can either get bitter or I can get better. I can develop a thankful heart, for we have been given so much. And Dr. Moore wrote a whole book about, am I going to get bitter or better? We have a lot to be thankful for in this country, don't we? We have a lot that we have been given. And sometimes we do take it for granted, don't we? Every day. Every day we take it for granted. Now you might be wondering why I have the sermon title, 5 Kernels of Corn. When the Pilgrims, those early people who lived in the eastern part of the United States, had very little to eat. And what they had for a ration for the day was 5 kernels of corn. Can you imagine? 5 kernels of corn, and that was their ration for the day. And so what the people in Plymouth continue to do, and I suspect they probably do it today, as they sit down for a meal, they sit down and next to their plate are 5 kernels of corn to remind them where they came from, to remind them of the blessings that they had, to remind them how gracious God is in their daily life. How awesome it is to serve a God who is so caring and yet sometimes seems so distant at times. And yet they would want to share in that. 5 kernels of corn were all that were left each day. We could go on with many stories about people and how they have blessed our lives and how the challenge for us to continue is to bless someone else's life. It's easy, isn't it, to forget, but we are challenged to always remember. I think throughout the scriptures, no matter what we're reading, we're always challenged to remember the graciousness of God, even in the most difficult times. Even when everything seems to be going amiss and when everything seems to be going wrong, God's presence is there if we will only listen and heed. That's our challenge always, isn't it? Every day. To wake up being thankful. To wake up and giving the praise to God for all that we have. Whether it is a lot or little. We are asked to share out of the goodness and graciousness of God. So thanks be to God